probably read on the website, with all of us being at home a lot more, and obviously cooking at home a lot more, the grocery store, even though it was marked as an essential business a year ago, just about, certainly for all of us, it has definitely become essential along with the workers who are there. But do we really know what goes on behind the back scenes of the grocery stores? And certainly for Benjamin, he began to wonder about this, and he'll tell you how it all started for him. But he took this on over 5 years ago and really began to investigate it in a huge way. And he is here with us tonight from upstate New York. His home is in Brooklyn,
Oh, sure.
New York right now. So I'd like to introduce Benjamin Lorr to us this evening. We're delighted that he's here. And the subtitle of this book is The Dark Miracle of American Supermarkets. And I think that he will explain part of that title to us also tonight. So welcome, Benjamin. And again, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Hey, thank you guys. Can you guys hear me, like with the thumbs up? It's all good? Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. And I'll give a quick overview of myself, and I'll give a quick overview of the book, because it did sell out, which is like one of these good, terrible problems to have. So I'm assuming that very few people have read it. It's back, so it should be available just about anywhere books are sold at this point. But a quick introduction to me as a writer. I'm a writer first. I'm an outsider. You know, I believe in going like really deep into various areas, and spending a lot of time just talking to everyone that I can possibly get my hands on, a lot of different competing voices, and trying to synthesize them together. I'm the farthest thing from an expert. I'm writer first, but I am extremely patient, and I take a long time to write. My first book was on a yoga cult, the Bikram yoga world. You may have heard of it. It was called Hellbent. I spent about a full year just practicing the yoga to get close to the guru, and then spent time interviewing everyone in that community. Eventually it turned into, this was back in 2012, but it turned into kind of a Me Too story where the guru was sexually assaulting various practitioners. But again, it was a book that involved like a lot of patience and a lot of going deep, and really trying to understand why people were drawn to this charismatic personality, and why they were doing the yoga. And this book is in some ways very similar to that. I wanted to understand the grocery store. I'm somebody who's always loved the grocery store, which may put me in an odd camp. But when I go on vacation, sometimes I'll just go and stroll the aisles, and I find them somewhat soothing and relaxing, but also extremely powerful. Like, it's almost hallucinogenic. You go and walk down these aisles that are just full of options, and the abundance, and thinking that, you know, kind of a chore, something that I think is utterly boring and banal, puts me in touch with things that the greatest kings and emperors, pharaohs of the past couldn't touch in terms of options. And yet that combination of the power and the banality, the boredom, is something that I really wanted to investigate and just figure out how it worked. So that's kind of my story as how I got into the book. But it's a $701 billion industry, the grocery industry, and it's extremely wide ranging. So I can show you a few pictures of you know, like where my approach to it. But essentially I started at the top. I'm gonna share my screen so you won't get to see my face anymore. But here's some pictures that, oh, as a host, you've disabled screen sharing.
Oh dear. You know, there are a few things that I'm still. Oops, no.
It's okay if you make me the host.
I'm hitting share screen now,
Oh no, that'll let you share your screen.
Oh dear, no, I don't want to do that. No, I don't
I think what you need to do is go to probably participants.
Participants, right.
Or
and click on, yeah, okay, hold on.
Click on me and just allow me to be host. Or I can just narrate this. It won't be nearly as, it won't be as quite as interesting.
Well, let me see here. I've done this once before, but I'm just not all that.
Don't worry.
Here we go. I'm clicking on you.
Does it say like allow him to be host?
There are a few things I'm just not all that educated on. Let me, you know, I have a.
You see the button that says more?
Let me see, yeah. How do you share screen? I'm clicking on Benjamin. No, I don't want to share my screen.
No.
I want Benjamin. Okay, so if I click on Benjamin, and then I have, there's something up here called more, right?
Under him, yeah.
No, up here. Sorry, buddy.
Go to him.
Yeah.
Well,
there's the more. Okay, I got it, Benjamin. And then make a co-host, right? Or make host.
Yeah, make host.
Okay, yeah, okay, you're in charge now. All right.
I'm the captain now.
Did that work?
Captain Phillips. It did. So let's see. Can you guys see a little a screen with like my handsome face and the covers of the books?
Yes.
And just to give you a sense, like there's me doing yoga. I got
Is that you? Oh my.
Extremely good at doing yoga when I was writing the yoga book. And it was not a book about how you do yoga, though. I guess this is just a kind of, again, my approach. But I wanted to learn as much about that world as possible to figure out why people were in the big, so attracted to this guru. And then that's me working as a Whole Foods employee, which I did for this book, among many other things. But I thought I couldn't really write about the grocery industry unless I worked on the retail floor. And I had worked on the lot of retail when I was, in college and before college, and just minimum wage jobs. But the jobs had changed so much that I thought I needed to kind of go back. But so I guess where I began in this story was at the very top with Trader Joe's. I got really lucky. Joe Kalum, who is the founder and the CEO of Trader Joe, and that's his wife, Alice, next to him, was quite a visionary. He founded Trader Joe's in the 1950s, if you can believe it. I don't know to what extent Trader Joe's has penetrated the Colorado market, but
we don't have one here in Denver. They're very big. But we don't have anything here.
And it's a very interesting chain because it does things different. But essentially, I got to spend a lot of time with the CEO, and I got to start thinking about the grocery industry from his point of view. And I got to ask him like many questions. And he brought a lot of information that we don't really have time to get into. But essentially, disaggregating between a continuous goods, like I guess Joe looked in the 1950s. He was a real visionary in many ways, and he looked at the consumer landscape and he thought people aren't going to want the same homogeny that they're being given right now. And he saw several trends that were gonna change how consumption happened. He saw the GI Bill of Rights, the guaranteed returning soldiers the right to a college education, was going to hit a third generation of soldiers coming back from Vietnam. It had already hit World War II. Sorry, not World War I. It already hit Korea, and then it was going to soldiers coming back from Vietnam were going to be given the right to go to college at an affordable case, and that was going to expand the people who were going to college in ways that had never been done before. And he thought that was going to change what people wanted to buy. That just the act of becoming educated was going to increase their vocabulary, and the increase in their vocabulary was going to lead them to want to feel clever when they shop. And and he was, you know, he was very careful. He didn't think it was going to make people smarter. He didn't call them more intelligent. He thought it was going to make them more clever, and they were going to change their shopping decisions. In the same way, he saw the 747 come out, which was going to radically cheapen the cost of international airfare, and that was going to allow people to travel in ways that they had never traveled before. And just as travel being another form of education, that was going to change the way people approach the grocery store. So there's much more than I can get into here, but that gives a flavor of the ways that he was approaching thinking of marketing products, thinking about the demographics of the consumer who was there, and then thinking about the burden on the store of the mid-1950s grocery store, which was essentially trying to be everything to everyone, had enormous SKU count. So SKU is the number of individual items in a store. And these stores had about 65,000 individual items. And probably, you know, one of the biggest things that I kept running up against in this book is that numbers like 65,000 individual items in your average boring, I'm not talking about a Sam's Club grocery store, is a number that a human being who's a buyer or a category manager simply can't get their mind around. It's an overwhelming responsibility for these people. And what happens is they simply stop going in deep and they outsource that decision making to large brands like the Kellogg's or the Group or what have you out there. And Joe and Trader Joe's did very much the opposite. Instead of trying to sell all the goods in the world, he shrunk down the offerings. And so Trader Joe's operates very differently. It only has about, in his day, only had about 1,500 items, which sounds like a lot, but is minuscule in the scale of most supermarkets, which again are at that 65,000 level. And that allowed his buyers to become experts over what they were buying. They allowed them to connect to producers, manufacturers, farmers, and seek out items that were better at a cheaper price, what he would call outstanding goods. And so that's where I began the book, was by thinking about the CEO level. But very quickly, I moved down into voices that we hear much less of. And so I spent time with a trucker. I drove with her on her rounds. This is the inside of her cab. Trucking, you know, is responsible for everything in our lives. Just about every material good, every consumable good comes to us on a truck in some form or another. It is a massive industry. The number one employer in the majority of states are truck drivers. It is also something that has been utterly transformed by deregulation under President Carter and then under Reagan. What trucking was a middle-class job. You know, we have this image of truckers as kind of scruffy but lovable, BJ and the Bear, breaker. That image has been completely changed over the last 30 to 40 years, starting with President Carter and deregulation, into a place where the trucker is essentially a commodity. And trucking is looking at all times for the lowest price, and that causes a race to the bottom, which again, I can't really do it justice in this. It's the type of thing you have to read, but it is like the details are excruciating. The trucker I was with was working 70 to 80 hour work weeks. She was extremely vigilant, an excellent driver. She was grossing about $120,000 a year and taking home $17,000. And that $17,000 is what we calculated together, but honestly, it was probably inflated by her pride. The week that I was with her, she made $100, and the several weeks before that, she was making $100 for that 70-hour week, which sounds incredible in America today, but she was really caught in something that was akin to a debt peonage, where she was an owner operator, quote unquote, of her truck, and all fees were taken out of her paycheck before she got the paycheck. And so no matter how much she was making, there was just this blizzard of deductions that would take her right back to almost nothing. And she was homeless and living inside of her truck. And from there, I actually started out with her because it just allowed me to go into the warehouses of America and these kind of like off-limit spaces. And then I decided I would follow the journey of a product to shelf. And this was a product called salsa, a combination coleslaw salsa, pretty delicious. It was run by a small entrepreneur named Julie Boucher, who was one of the hardest working people I met. And I just got to follow her and figure out what it took to get this product that was her baby onto a shelf and into a retail store. And the answer is it was extraordinarily complex, involved far much more labor than I ever could have imagined on her part, and required a lot of financial backing that she didn't have. One thing, that people don't understand about retail products is you're not just competing against your other similar items. Like Julie wasn't, as a condiment, just competing against relishes and mustard and other coleslaw salsas if they exist out there. She was competing against the store itself, which was operating as a landlord and selling her retail space. And that space was either sold in a straight up dollars for inches transaction, which would be called a slotting fee, or it was sold in terms of them asking her for free product to get on their shelf just as a barrier to entry. And that landscape makes a lot of sense if you're a grocery store. It also makes a lot of sense if you are attached to venture capital, who can pay those high spaces and weed out your competitors for you. But if you're a lone entrepreneur like Julie was, with just a pretty tasty product, but a hard go of it, it can be extremely devastating and hard work. From there, I went, and like I said, I worked in a Whole Foods front end retail. That's me as a fishmonger. And it got to see how those jobs had changed in a similar way that trucking had changed. I worked a number of minimum wage jobs over the course of my life, from bartending to waiting tables to retail. And I wasn't quite prepared for how those jobs had changed in 2020 from when I was doing it back in the 90s. But to suffice to say, a lot of the same forces that were working on Lynn were working in the retail space, which is to say that as an employee, you were treated far more like a commodity than you were treated like an employee. So I would get the schedule 3 days in advance for the week, and I was asked to hold the whole week open. So this is for a minimum wage part-time job where I was working about 20 hours a week. I had to hold every available working time open to do that job, which would, I was obviously not depending on this, but it would prevent someone from getting a second job because it would prevent you from, arranging childcare, because you don't know when you're going to work until you're given the schedule, which only happens right in advance of your actual shift. Almost a bizarrely dehumanizing system that was not in place when I was working minimum wage, in high school. But the whole system has been geared towards efficiency in every aspect, and products are expected to be on shelf with hours of notice. So employees become extremely inefficiently allocated if they don't have that same flexibility. So from the grocery store's point of view, this makes perfect sense. From the employee's point of view, it makes them essentially a disposable part. From there, I went in to some factory farms with activists because I wanted to understand the system of certification. I'm not necessarily an animal rights activist, but I wanted to understand what it meant when somebody called a product rainforest friendly. What did it mean when something was called fair trade? What did it mean when the Humane Society put the labels on the fair egg? So to do that, I erroneously thought it would help me to go and see these places for myself. So I found some animal rights activists who had broke me into some cage-free cage chicken houses and swine yards. And I got in touch with certifiers and followed them on their rounds. But it really opened up the entire world of for-profit certification for me. And finally, from there, I went to the bottom of the seafood commodity chain in Thailand, and this is a picture of Thailand, and then followed shrimp as it went to market. And shrimp is kind of the ultimate commodity good. If you go back 40 years, shrimp was more expensive per pound than steak. It was a luxury good. You think of country clubs, shrimp on a silver platter with cocktail sauce. And now shrimp is in just about everything from, airport salads to lo mein that you can order for very cheap. So that story of shrimp's journey from a luxury good to a commodity good was interesting, but also I was very interested in what effects that had on the commodity workers, who are, of course, this is a global agriculture, all the same forces that are happening in the US to commodity goods, but to people who are even farther away, out of sight, out of mind. And at the very bottom of the commodity chain, things got very dark indeed. This is a picture of what's called a trash fishing boat, and trash fish make up the bottom of the shrimp commodity chain, in that shrimp are carnivorous. So just because you farm them, you still have to get the protein from something. They get this protein. It's the fish that would otherwise get discarded from other commercial fishing boats that are out for bigger fish like tuna. And as that industry expanded, the trash fishing grew to a sizable industry, and it started being staffed. So it's a pretty awful job. It started being migrant workers, trafficked migrant workers to do the work, and they were there's really no other word than enslaved migrant workers. And so this is you can see this is the boat I snuck on with the help of some people, NGOs in that area. And this is the migrant workers' sleeping quarters. That they would stay on this boat for 6 months at a time to a year at a time, sleeping in this. That comes up to about my mid-thigh. And they would be sleeping there for about 4 to 5 hours a night for that 6 months. They were trafficked from Myanmar, imprisoned on the boat, and forced to work against, again, there's no real other word in the English language except for slave. The man I spent a lot of time with, and who I profile in the book, was he watched his best friend get beaten and kicked off the boat, and he watched people get shot. And if he didn't work, he was going to get beaten. He didn't make any money for the 5 years that he was on this boat. And what's interesting is how much the entire system both abhors and doesn't want anything to do with this labor. There's no one who's happy about this situation. The grocery buyers are not greedy, kind of slave owning, like the farthest thing in the world from their mind is to be attached to this. This is a stain on their product. At the same time, the grocery industry is so big and the inputs are so vast that they are helpless in terms of rooting this out. And so when I was there in 2015 in Thailand, there was about 15 to 60% of labor was coming from these enslaved fishermen, despite the fact that, and I believe they were being honest, every major shrimp importer, exporter, and manufacturer wanted to root this out. But the vastness of the supply, the isolation of the boats, conspired to make that impossible. And I guess that gives you a flavor of the range of topics that are in this book. It covers a lot of ground. And there's me at a diner where I wrote most of it. I'll stop screen sharing and come back to you. But that gives you a sense of the breadth of the book and the different areas I tried to cover. And I can stop there because I've talked for quite a while. But let me know if you have questions, or I can always keep jabbering.
Well, Benjamin, one of my questions, just to lead it off, there's talk in the book when you were with Lynn, the truck driver, and I think, well, it seemed to me one of the things that kept her going, and I see we might have some questions here in the chat. One of the questions that I had, or one of the thoughts I had about Lynn, is that it was her sense of humor that must have kept her going, because her life seemed to be so difficult, because she didn't have quite a sense of humor.
She had a great sense of humor. I will say also, trucking was filled with people who were, had served tours overseas, ex-military. And there was a really interesting dynamic of people who were kind of like, I'm going to put my head down and do this job no matter what and get it done. And it was both a noble thing to watch, but it was heartbreaking because they were in a system that was rigged. There was no way she could work her way out of the system.
Right, and you explain a lot of that in the book.
Yeah, she was going to try as hard as possible, and she really offered no excuses for her failing. She took it as a personal failure on her part, and it was a really interesting dynamic of this kind of personal accountability that was getting exploited, I think, by the trucking companies. Sure. Often they actually, some of the worst trucking companies would also tie a lot of religion into this, and say you're going to redeem yourself. They'd really create a huge narrative about the job being a redemption opportunity for people who, again, were either coming from war situations, the ex-military, or from other minimum wage jobs, and they wanted a way out to a job where they controlled their own destiny. That was the big promise.
Well, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that sense of humor was part of the way she survived, but she also survived through this kind of work ethic that was really interesting.
Well, but you also talk about with her, I mean, the women truck drivers have so much more danger around them. And how did you connect with her? Because I would have just assumed that she would be very leery of having a guy, even though it's you, ride with her for a full week. I mean, you lived in the truck with her. So how would she have agreed to have you be in the truck with her for a whole week? How did you connect with her?
Yeah, I connected to her through a trucking, a different trucker. I was looking in particular to ride with a woman trucker because they are more vulnerable. Like everything, male truckers are extremely exploited too, but every way that a male trucker is exploited, a female trucker is exploited worse, because to get trained as a trucker, you have to partner with someone and you live in the same truck, and your supervisor, ostensibly because you're a trainee, is living in a bunk bed in a truck with you, and your a chance to become a fully certified trucker and get a full salary, because you get paid a training rate during that time, depends on their passing you. And so it doesn't take like a rocket scientist to figure out that if you are an unsavory trainer, you are in a position of like real ability to like take advantage of that situation. And of course, there are a lot of unsavory people who realize that and then gravitate to that profession because of it. And so I really wanted to find a female trucker who would like kind of give me insight. Lynn, or the woman I call Lynn in the book, I should say that's a pseudonym because she's a working trucker and I didn't want to get her fired. She's 6'2". She's strong. She had a gun. I think I didn't intimidate her, and we talked for quite a bit beforehand. So I was very transparent where I'm coming from and what I wanted to do. But trucking is a culture where they'll just kick you off the truck in the middle of I-80, and you just have to walk. And I think, that's unimaginable. But I think in the back of Lynn's mind, she would have thought that if things had gotten bad, she would have probably pulled a gun and kicked me to the curb.
Yeah. And then when it comes to, you talked about the woman who made the product salsa, it made me think of how many products that may be very good and interesting that we might never see just because of all the ins and outs that Julie had in trying to get her product into a grocery store. And so one of the things that and of course we live in a small town. We have a grocery store here that's halfway decent, has a lot of organic products, but it's the same old stuff all the time. Never anything new. And so would you speak to that a little bit? And then you talk about Trader Joe's, where he was intent on bringing in new and unusual products, right?
Yes. I would say there's two different dynamics going on there. One is that your local store is probably, remember I was talking about, when I talked about Trader Joe's, 65,000 different products. Mm-hmm. It's the same old, because that's the easiest thing for an overwhelming buyer to do. You're not seeking out new gifts. You're just replenishing what you have. It's the only way to survive and make your life as easy as possible. Plus, you can then lean on those people year after year and kind of get lower. You develop relationships. There's a tremendous amount of bribes in the grocery industry. This also won't surprise anyone. I guess I should say I was very surprised by it, but now that I've learned it, it makes total sense. You want to get your product on shelf, and there's one gatekeeper who's a buyer. If you sweeten a side deal with that gatekeeper, they can make things happen for you. And so that's pretty frequent. But what you were saying about Julie, about small products getting on the shelf and like breaking in and innovation, I think that's a hugely under-recognized thing. Yeah, I mean, I was talking to, kind of various industry insiders and buyers, and they would always make the point, like, the founder of Chobani wasn't the first person to bring Greek yogurt to the American market. They're just the one, that person had family money, and that family money allowed them to seed themselves in a number of stores. And so there was a number of initial entrepreneurs who just couldn't make it on a national scale. And it does have effects. It creates a game where getting into stores is much more of a gamble, and the cost of the gamble has gone up. So you need to attach yourself. The kind of American grocery dream of like building up from a farmer's market to a 1 to 2 stores, and then 1 to 2 stores to chained, and you go to national. Like, that process is much harder now than it used to be. It's not that it's impossible, but it's possible.
Yeah, and so with us and supporting the local farmers here, small ranchers, when we go to the farmers market, that's where we see different products, new things, different heirloom tomatoes, different types of produce. We see the scale from this little town of Crestone, which is about 40 miles from here, where she has all sorts of different, products similar to what Julie has, different types of relishes, different sorts of different canned goods and things that she's made and produced that we would never see in a grocery store, that we just love. And that's why we like to support that.
Yeah, absolutely. I see Larry in the chat is saying $59,000 a year average truckers for Salida, and 105 to 240K. Is this just a lie? For top salaries from the top 6 trucking companies. I'd say 2 things. I think the 105 to 240 is probably just a lie. That is probably just a recruiting strategy. There's a number of lawsuits that you can look to where these companies will put out things and then they get sued and then they walk them back and then they put them right back out there. The $59,000 might not be a lie, in the sense that trucking is a really big business. So what I was focusing on was OTR truckers, which is over the road truckers, who kind of are the ones who are bringing groceries cross country. It's a tight, it's an industry with turnover that's 115% per year, which is a statistic that shouldn't make much sense at first glance. 100% turnover means everyone in the fleet was hired and fired that, or not necessarily fired, chose to leave that year. And so that is flipping over more than one time in that year. That I can say those truckers are not making $59,000 a year, but there are local truck drivers who also will probably fall in that salary band, that are doing different types of work, that work for smaller companies that aren't subject necessarily to these deregulatory forces, and that very well might be making that number. So, yeah, I mean, I couldn't comment more than that, except for to say, I would say that, yes, $100,000 a year trucker is possible. It means that you own your own and you came into the industry with some money of your own to get off your feet. It's very, very, very rare, even for people who have been in the industry for years. Yes, and also debt is the issue. Debt and deductions from the paycheck are exactly the issue why there's a big disparity between advertised gross pay and actual take-home pay. Yes, and the margin for grocery stores is extremely low. It's a fascinating history as to why. It's actually the definitional fact. Sorry, this is from Suzanne in the chat, who says, like, someone told me that the grocery store has cripplingly low margin. That's actually how grocery stores work. That's the miracle of the grocery store. And it's both a positive and a negative thing. Groceries a volume game. We all have to buy groceries. That's, at the end of the day, it's one of the few areas that you are guaranteed to be spending a significant chunk of your budget. And because of that regularity, they can set low margins and work on volume and still make a competitive profit for the large, for most cases. And essentially that's what the supermarket, that was to the extent that the supermarket was an innovation. Prior to that, you would have stores that had relatively high markups, but also relatively few options, like the general store, or kind of turn of the century grocery stores. And people discover that if we carry a lot of different options and we make the margin really low, people will buy more than they would have otherwise. It's kind of like, it's the supersize me idea. And you create a feedback loop where by reducing prices, people buy more than they would otherwise, and you make it back on margin. The last thing to say on this is that low margin worked really well for a long time, but then I was talking about Julie having to pay fees to get on shelves, right? That side money, which is called trade spend or slotting fees or free fill or buy one, get ones, right? That is all rocket fuel to the bottom line of these grocery stores. So their margin might be 1% on the goods that are being sold, but then Julie comes in and gives them a free case to sell at 100% profit. It makes quite a big difference. Or she just gives them $25,000 to just get into the store. That makes a tremendous difference. And the numbers are actually bigger than what I'm saying. Like, national rollout for a frozen SKU in 2018, when I was writing, was about $1 million just to get one item, on a nationwide rollout. So if you're a chain, for one chain, so that's big money that you can then keep a 1% margin and still do okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kathy Youngins brought up the subject of waste in grocery stores. And I think you do touch on that somewhat in your book as well. In fact, yeah. I remember you do, yeah.
I touch on it. I don't touch on it quite. There are some great books on food waste that are out there. Jonathan Bloom wrote a book on food waste that I think really covers it well. I guess I thought that was, so first, food waste is huge. It's a big part of the system. I was wary of going there, one, because I thought it had been covered quite a bit by others. And two, I really wanted to keep this book in a descriptive place. Obviously, you can see that, you know, there's a lot of negative things in the book, but I really didn't want to write a book that was like a nannying book that was gonna like tisk people for not finishing the food on their plate. And so I let other people do the food waste case, which I think is impressive. It's there. But to some extent, it is the flip side of the efficiency that consumers demand. You know, if you have consumers who are demanding continuous supply of goods, and there's extreme price comparison on otherwise identical looking things, you gotta compete with your neighbor, and you're gonna have to have really pretty tomatoes, and that results in a lot of waste on all levels.
And yeah, one thing that you said as you were speaking, you used the phrase something about certification, for-profit certification, when you talked about going undercover to look at some of those places because you wanted to learn about certification on foods. Isn't that kind of an oxymoron? For-profit certification.
Yeah, although if this is a group of farmers, like I'm not going to be telling you guys anything new. Like certification in this country is really weirdly set up. It is not government regulation for the most. I should stop. It's not weird. It's piecemeal. There's just a number of interlocking ways that we guarantee the claims on our food. So for food safety, for all certifications, producers indemnify the retailer by taking on the burden of guaranteeing their food is safe, is whatever, that gluten-free, whatever claim that they want to make, they take that burden on. This is not something they necessarily asked for. It's written into the contract to deal with every major retailer. But then, so they have to pay for this certification themselves just to get into the store. But then it's a free market certification system. And so they can then shop for the certification regime. And there's a number of different ones out there that will make their life easier. And this is actually incredibly complicated system. And there's places where the producer has a lot of freedom for choosing for claims like gluten-free, fair trade. And there's other types of certifications where they have almost no freedom and they have to do exactly what the retailer wants. So if you're selling to Costco, you got to get Costco's certifications through. It's not through Costco, it's through their third-party provider. And if you're selling to Whole Foods, you got to go through Whole Foods' third-party provider. If you're selling to Walmart, you got to go through this, that, and the other. And it then becomes like a blizzard of different people that you have to deal with. There's all, you know, it's also changing. People recognize that this system is extremely inefficient. So there's a big movement to making unified certifications so that producers don't have to do this. When I was writing, and I think the current situation is it's still pretty fatiguing for the producer. And some, you know, big producers will have up to 2 to 3 certifications per week, every week of the year, coming through their factories or their farms from the various different people they're selling to. So that's a lot, probably more convoluted. That's why I'm a writer, not a talker. But it's a tough situation. It's an interesting situation that we don't spend a lot of time on. Yes. So Suzanne, we vote with our wallets, but our votes are being channeled. I think that is one of the big takeaways that I had from this book. I grew up on Eric Schlosser, Michael Pollan, you know, some of these guys, and Eric Schlosser ends Fast Food Nation by saying, like, make it your way, this riff on Burger King, vote with your dollars. Marion Nestle says that all the time. And I think I ran up against the limits of that with this book. The thing is, there's too many layers between what your vote is and how the store reacts on one hand. And two, global commodity is so vast that the system is built to kind of channel good intentions and then subvert them. I do a better job of kind of unpacking this in the book than I'm going to do right now. But essentially, global commodity, it's like the race to the bottom is kind of, it's a very real phenomenon, and the certifiers are always going to be one step behind the movement of industry. So when I was in Thailand, there was enormous human rights violations going on there. People cracked down on Thailand. That has changed. The cost of shrimp in Thailand therefore rises. Therefore, industry moves to India, to the Philippines, to Malaysia. The cost of shrimp there is still cheap. The global market shops over there. And because they're getting this cheap price, inevitably the human rights violations displace there too. Like the prices are too low so to sustain anything else. And like India with its caste system, like every expert I spoke to during the book felt very certain that the same things that Thailand became infamous for were going to crop up in these new places, because that's what it means to follow low price around the globe. The certification regimes haven't necessarily caught up to that reality yet. The media attention hasn't caught up to that reality. And so it makes the vote with your foot, the vote with your food, vote with your wallet paradigm problematic. You might be trying to do the right thing and have a lot of unintended consequences with that, namely making Thai producers who have then reformed their own supply chain more out of step and less able to make a living than they were prior to the reform. It's not an answer that I feel good giving, because it feels a little hopeless, and the book doesn't have a great solution for that. And no one that I spoke to had a great solution to that. So I didn't want to just package up a great solution to make people feel good and sell more books. I just laid out the way industry insiders saw this, which was as a really hard problem.
Yeah.
And sorry, this is all about the U.S. shrimp market. Thailand is our number one. We get most of our shrimp from Thailand. The U.S. domestic shrimp market, like Gulf shrimp, Bubba Gump shrimp in your Forrest Gump memories, that wouldn't apply to this. None of the things I'm discussing would be affected by domestic produced shrimp. But that's a tiny minority of where our shrimp comes from. You can buy it. You'll pay more for it at register, and it's not going to be the stuff you're given in a stir fry. Because those guys, unless it's a fancy restaurant and they say it on the menu.
So I'll just put in a plug for SOIL Sangre de Cristo. We can all do our best to support our local food economy and farmers, small ranchers, the best we can. Now, of course, they don't raise shrimp, but we can do everything to support our local food here with SOIL Sangre de Cristo and going to the farmers markets. Max Keller with Triangle Oasis does have a winter market, which will be a week from this Saturday. So that's one way of supporting with our wallets. That, of course, is not everything that we need in our kitchens, but we can do our best to support it and help it grow here in our own area.
100%. I mean, I think one of the few things that I came away with is this is a system that's defined by lack of trust, and a lot of the problems with certification become because we're trying to do the impossible, which is to supervise a global production system. And you get it in airport security, people laugh at it like it's an impossible game. But with food, we pay for those labels because it offers a marginal sense of security and trust. But it's a fiction. However, local producers, real relationships with producers, a real sense of trust. That is a way to like step back from this game and create like meaningful relationships and a meaningful food system. The problem is that's just not what the grocery store is about. Like you said, you can't. Your people aren't shopping at these places for a reason. They don't offer the same experience. They don't offer the same abundance. It would take consumer expectations changing to do that on a large scale. But I mean, it's the one of the few things that I can unequivocally say is like a beautiful difference maker. You know, if you form your own relationships with local producers on things, you know, that is, and you feel like you can trust them, you can cut through oceans of like problematic practices and red tape in doing that.
That's right.
And, sorry, Larry says, isn't this the same problem in virtually everywhere if we're willing to pay more for food and get better quality? It certainly is. You know, not every industry. There are some that are more immune. I think where workers are more out of sight and where people are less connected to them, there's a less of an ability to totally commodify them. But, you know, some of these pressures are inherent to you know, any commodified global system. Fast fashion is famously has a lot, you know, a lot of these issues. And I don't think that focusing on the food part is particularly helpful in coming to solutions. In fact, the one thing I think I say in the book on this is like thinking about food and diet is really the last way we're going to solve these problems. It's like the least helpful energy. It's kind of very, you know, personal and selfish. What we need is like policy level decisions, you know, things that strengthen workers' abilities to advocate for themselves, things that create floors. So, you know, people aren't competing against themselves or against each other on kind of basic issues around either employment or standards. That has to come from the top. Trade treaties with enforcement teeth. So you can't just go to somewhere cheaper and outsource your labor again and again and again. And if you try to do that, there's some, you know, not a certifier who comes to your door on an audit, but a policeman who could arrest you for locking your employees in a shed and forcing them to work overtime, which is a completely normalized practice in some parts of the world. Like that is not a crazy, egregious story. But that's not going to get solved by a certifier. That's going to get solved by a police action because it's an illegal crime. So thinking about it as something that we would expect a grocery store to solve for us is like crazy. We wouldn't expect the grocery store to solve a mugging, you know, or like, you know, it's like, these are crimes. We should treat them as crimes, not as something that the retail industry is responsible for or farmers are responsible for.
Yeah. Benjamin, you hit on the head. We're hearing more and more about that. You know, it's going to take policy to start solving these issues. Before we wrap things up, we're getting close, but Benjamin, I want to introduce you to Woody Tosh. Woody is with us tonight. He lives in Boulder, and he is the founder of the Slow Money movement that maybe you've heard about. And that's how SOIL Sangre de Cristo and the other regions of SOIL in Colorado got started. And Woody, would you like to add something to this conversation? And I want to be sure you were introduced to Benjamin. We've talked about, and I told you about the book, and I'm glad you're with us tonight.
Well, thanks, PJ. Yeah, I just put in the chat room, I said, this is why 600,000 people belong to CSAs in this country. Yeah. So I would just add, I come to a slightly different conclusion than Benjamin does, but not really, just like an emphasis on another syllable, which is, yes, grocery stores are never going to solve the problem, and certification is never going to solve the problem. Unfortunately, I'm a little more skeptical about your view about how policy solving the problem, although I agree with you, we need to try. We need to try to have the best policies we can and the best implementation. I think the real solution does come from the bottom up, which is CSAs, local food and whatnot. The only question there is, can it scale enough? Which seems impossible given our current mindset, but I don't think it is impossible. So I'll just throw out, just for the fun of it, just to throw a thing out at the end, just imagine that 10 times the number of people in America belong to CSAs in a generation. So there's 600,000 now. 10 times would only be 6 million people. That, I mean, it's not only, but it's still a fraction. It's still a small thing. But I think there's a lot of room for CSAs and local food systems to help people get around a lot of these problems. It's not perfect, just like you were saying, nothing's perfect. There's a lot of, every solution has certain limitations to it, but.
Oh no, absolutely.
But I think we're all in agreement that grocery.
As a proud CSA member, I couldn't agree more. I just think it's one of a number of solutions. And look, the more that we can encourage people to do that, the better, I think. And the more that people take it seriously and start sourcing their food, the better. I think it's not mutually exclusive with like global policy level trade treaties. But again, there's probably no silver bullet. If there was going to be a silver bullet, that would be the closest thing, scaling up those type of practices and getting people to create relationships that would thus change their expectations, because they would get a better sense of the work that goes into creating the food, and thus maybe not demand quite as much out of systems that are giving it, but they're delivering it because they're kind of shortchanging on the edges.
Right. No, one other comment I would say is I loved you when you were talking about the trust, and you know, to me, that's what you talk about a cross-cutting issue. The degree to which trust has been eroded / degraded, destroyed, obliterated by commodification, globalization, intermediation. You know, you talked a lot about it in different ways, and a grocery store is one kind of iconic example of that. In the pursuit of cheap, we create, you know, we kind of externalized all these other things, but the thing we really lost was trust, and we tried to artificially put it back in like an artificial ingredient with certification and branding and all these other things. So I agree with that 100%. I think that's another reason that the CSAs are so important, because even though they're small, they are genuine trust and relationship driven things, and we need more of that, obviously. So.
No, I love the idea of it, trust being an artificial ingredient that gets put in, because I think that's exactly right. It's very seductive. I know I do it as a consumer. You want to buy products that will guarantee various claims, because one, you want to do the right thing. You also want to do the healthy thing for yourself. But the more you think about it, the more it creates just levels of distrust, because who's certified? How do you know this? If it's a for-profit system, how do you know the certifier is doing it? Oh, we need a certifier for the certifier. Oh, well, how do we know they're doing it? We need a certifier for the certifier. You laugh, but those exist. That is the current situation. There are certifier of certifiers of certifiers, like 3 levels up. And what type of system is this at the end of the day? Like, do you feel safer from that? No, of course not. You don't. The more you start peering into this and abstracting it, the less trust there is. And the more you can connect with other people, the more you can actually bring that back in. It's a lot easier to say than it is to do, though. So maybe that's a good place to end things.
Maybe so.
Yeah, I want to add one last thing, just while we're riffing like this. So the same thing is true of the investing world. So when you shop at a supermarket for food, it's a perfect mirror image of shopping in a mutual fund for investment products. It's all exactly the same. There's no actual trust there. There's levels of certification. There's all kinds of problems with accountability. But deep down, you know that there's no way to build trust back into that. Well, I'm speaking for myself. Deep down, there's no way to really build trust back into a system where trust has been demolished. You know, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Anyway, hey, Benjamin, thank you so much for the book and what you're doing and everything. And PJ, thanks for putting this together.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I was just so happy that I just happened to hear that interview on NPR with Benjamin quite a while ago. And Benjamin, thank you very much for being with us tonight. We all appreciate it and learned a lot. And we wish you success. And I hope, well, I don't know if it's Random House or one of their subsidiaries who published your book, but I hope there'll be more available soon. That all
it's
of
out
us
there. It's out there. There was a crunch, but it got sold. It sold out for about a month, but it's back. So
great. Okay.
Anywhere books are sold.
Well, thank
but
you
it was
so
a real
much.
pleasure. Thank you so much, and I will look forward to the next time I spend 5 years doing something agri-related. I'm back here.
Great. Well, let us know when you come to Colorado. We'd love to host you in this part of Colorado.
Right.
Show you around. Thank you very much, Benjamin. And thank you all for coming and attending. If you have any other questions, please send them to SOIL Sangre de Cristo @gmail.com. And I'll be sure to Benjamin, would you mind if I sent you some other questions if they come up?
No, of course. I'll be slow. I'll be slow, but put them on.
That's all right. Thank you so much, everybody. Good evening. Thanks a lot.